Greetings. Assuming that most of you have completed the reading assignment for this week and that you've also viewed the supplementary videos I provided on your Moodle page as URLs, I thought it would behoove me as your professor to briefly go over some of the most important aspects of this week's work. First and most importantly was the discussion of social structure. Social structures are stable patterns of interaction which allow us to make sense of life. They impose order on what would otherwise be chaos. If you simply wanted to learn sociology from me at whatever time, it would be practically impossible were it not for the technology of the internet, which we're using right now. Otherwise, we would both be at our whims. Instead, we have the social structure of the classroom, the social structure of the lecture meeting, a time and place when we know we're going to interact, a time and place where we know what our various statuses are, mine as professor, yours as student, a time and place where we know what is expected of us, yours to be there in attendance, to pay attention, to take notes and internalize information, and mine, of course, to dispatch that information to you in the clearest, most concise, and effective manner that I can. In the absence of the social structure of the college lecture class, it's very unlikely that you would ever see an old fellow like me standing on, for instance, the side of a hill lecturing to 75 or 80 young persons and having them listen intently and quietly without interrupting. This is something that's only made possible by the social structure that we call the college lecture class, or in this case, the electronically delivered college lecture class. Please forgive my mispronunciation. I was startled by the house wren that is currently nesting with its mate on my porch. It decided to leave its nest to scurry out underneath the screen door. And that was a bit startling, to say the very least. One of the fundamental building blocks of social structure is status. A status is any socially occupied position that has a set of responsibilities and privileges attached. Each and every one of us occupies a number of statuses simultaneously. For instance, you occupy the status of son or daughter. You're also a citizen. You're also a student. You're also a driver, in all likelihood. You may very well be an athlete or a team member. In fact, if you consider it closely, the number of statuses that you occupy is broad and diverse. Each of these statuses has a set of responsibilities associated with it, and it defines how you or I behave when we occupy that particular status. All of the statuses that an individual occupies at once are called the individual's status set. Within a person's status set is the status that most well defines them, the status through which they wish to be defined by others and through which they tend to define themselves primarily. This is called their master status. For most of you, your master status is student. For people beyond education, the master status is typically associated with one's occupation. For instance, I am a sociologist. That is my master status. Sometimes an individual's master status may be associated with a particular characteristic that can't exactly be overlooked about them. Say, for instance, the person is physically handicapped and restricted to a wheelchair or blind. And in those sorts of instances, this particular characteristic has an overriding force and is often seen as the master status. For some individuals, the master status may be parent or alternately husband or wife. The common characteristic among master statuses, those held by us all, is that they are the essential factor through which we define ourselves, wish others to define us. Now, each and every status has a set of roles linked to it. For instance, my status as professor calls upon me to dispatch information to you and to clarify that information to the extent that it's possible, to attempt to empower you through enhancing your critical thinking skills, and of course, alternately, one of the roles associated with being a professor is evaluating your performance, therefore ranking you competitively against one another. Personally, associated with my master status as professor, unlike many others, I am what is called a student advocate. I really want my students to succeed. I hope for them to be successful personally, persevere, persistent, and successful individuals in their lives. As a result, this causes something called role conflict. Or rather, to be more precise, it would be called role conflict if the roles that were straining against one another were between statuses, like for instance the status of parent and the status of disciplinarian. Whereas, in fact, what I experience as a professor is not role conflict, but role strain. And role strain is when two roles that are linked to a single status become incompatible. And it's almost inevitable that this does sometimes happen. Once again, I want you to succeed, but on the other hand, it's my responsibility to dutifully evaluate your performance. So, the role strain will be the result of this. To be very clear, role conflict makes reference to when, for instance, a role associated with your student status calls upon you to study, but a role associated with your employee status calls upon you to be at work. Since you can't do both of these things at once, this is role conflict. Once again, to be clear, a role is a set of behavioral expectations associated with a particular status, and each status has a number of roles linked to it. As a reminder, we established early in the semester that statuses may be achieved or ascribed. An ascribed status is one that is conferred upon an individual at birth beyond their will. For instance, whether they are male or female, what country they're born in, what year they're born in. Achieved statuses, alternately, are those which are accomplished at least partially through the basis of one's own efforts. I am careful to say partially because while achieved statuses are brought about by one's own efforts, they almost always depend upon the assistance and facilitation of others in the process. Some other basic subcomponents of social structure would be primary groups and secondary groups. The primary group is a group of individuals who are linked on the basis of emotivity, empathy, sympathy, love. This group makes contact with one another very frequently, and they tend to sustain their relationship over a long period of time, if not permanently. Primary groups are best described by one's family. Secondary groups are larger groups, and unlike the family, which is not necessarily designed to accomplish any specific purpose, a secondary group is instrumental. It's designed to actually accomplish something. Our class, for instance, Sociology 101, is a secondary group. It's a secondary group because it's a larger group. It's highly specialized. The beginning of the meetings of the group and the end of the meetings of the group is already established. When the lectures occur and so on was clearly laid out. There was a specific beginning and a specific end. Social structures like this secondary group in which we participate are impersonal, not bound by emotivity or by empathy, but rather by shared objectives. Organizations are secondary groups that have a specific organizational structure. If you will forgive my redundancy, I should have perhaps said that there are secondary groups with a formal structure, meaning that they are designed to accomplish specific objectives. Formal organizations tend to be institutionalized social structures, such as the university, or the state, or the federal government. These formal organizations are designed to accomplish specific objectives, and they are run in a systematic, procedural manner. They're extremely impersonal. Bureaucratic organizations apply rationality and efficiency to increased effectiveness and profit. The iron law of oligarchy suggests that power within bureaucracies tends to consolidate towards the top of the structure. Formal organizations, whether they be governments or businesses, do not exist independently in an isolated environment. In fact, they exist in an environment where they are surrounded by others that seek to accomplish the same objectives and or are related to their activities specifically. The term organizational environment refers to the factors outside of an organization which either enhance or inhibit its ability to function. The current organizational environment in the United States, and for that matter around the world, has been severely disrupted by the coronavirus. This is because manufacturing, particularly heavy manufacturing and technologically sophisticated manufacturing in China, has been stopped. Shipping from China to elsewhere in the world has been stopped. And prior to this time, Chinese work, labor, manufactured goods, and so on are absolutely essential to not only the American economy, but to the global economy. As a result of the virus, other components of the economy, you might say institutional components, such as the airline industry, have been adversely impacted. People are reluctant to fly and or are forbidden to do so between countries. As a result of this, airlines are losing tremendous amounts of money, which costs taxpayers and those who hold retirement accounts and so on large amounts of money as well. So there's a ripple effect, institutional ripple effect. As the airline industry is crippled, then also is the hotel and entertainment industries. The absence of professional athletics and various concerts and other public performances like plays and so on that would normally occur are all at a stop, and this domino effect of economic downturn is driven by the coronavirus, but it describes an organizational environment which is extremely difficult, not only for businesses, but governments, and by this I mean all over the world. While social structure was initially given consideration primarily by Emile Durkheim in early sociology, during the latter part of the 20th century, the study of social structure became primarily one conducted by symbolic interactionists. The symbolic interactionist paradigm within sociology is the overarching set of ideas that society is organized not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Individuals make sense of their world subjectively, and reality resides within the individual consciousness of the individual. Forgive me, Department of Redundancy Department. To be clear, what I just meant to say, only through consciousness, awareness, and interpretation of the stimuli that is in the real world can reality exist. Three important contributions to the symbolic interactionist paradigm theoretically were dramaturgical analysis from Irving Goffman, ethnomethodology from Harold Garfinkel, and social constructionism from Peter Berger. In their book, The Social Construction of Reality, Berger and Luckman propose that reality is something that is, in fact, individual, subjective, and defined not internally, but through our internalization of the external. To clarify that rather complex last statement, perhaps I should put it a different way. Reality is something that we share within a particular society or culture because it is socially defined. What is an appropriate breakfast? Eggs and bacon, a bowl of cereal, maybe some fruit, some granola, yogurt. Those all seem like very appropriate breakfasts to us because our culture happens to socially construct reality in a manner that's consistent with what I said. However, we're not used to eating things like bugs or worms, and in all likelihood, we don't eat raw fish, probably don't have seaweed, and there are probably any one of a number of different highly viable and possibly even potentially delicious foods out there in the world that people eat for breakfast, but we don't. And why is that? It's because the social construction of reality in their particular cultures are different from the one that we find in our own. What we think is beautiful, what we think is ugly, what we think is good, what we think is bad, what we think is desirable or undesirable, what we think is appropriate or inappropriate. All these are social constructions. So, socially constructed reality is culturally specific. It obviously varies from one particular society to the next. And socially constructed reality has to do with the fact that we lend meaning to the stimuli that we experience through the process of interpretation. It's the meaning assignment process. We're assigning meaning to that stimuli that we're perceiving. But the way that we assign meaning, while it seems to spring forth from within us, is actually meaning that we have internalized through the socialization process of making interactive contact with others throughout our entire lives. Berger and Luckman's insight into how cultural information that we internalize informs our way of understanding the world in which we live helps to explain the types of disagreements which result in international conflict, and as well at the micro level between individuals, since each of us subjectively assigns meaning to that which we experience. Irving Goffman's book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, which was published in 1956, was a tremendous landmark, an overlap between sociology and mainstream society. It was at the top of the New York Times bestseller list for an impressively long period of time in the fiction category. That's relatively rare for a sociology textbook. What Goffman does is he performs a very micro-analytical process of day-to-day interaction using the tools of the conceptual framework of the theater. This did already pre-exist Goffman, that which we would call dramaturgy. But what Goffman does is he creates dramaturgical analysis within symbolic interactionism, within sociology. Dramaturgical analysis is the application of theatrical terms and concepts to the analysis of day-to-day life. It is an illumination of the inevitable processes whereby which individuals must make differential presentations to various audiences in order to achieve desired outcomes in their lives. With each status that an individual occupies, there is a particular audience that they perform for, and a particular set of performance routines, roles, if you will, that must be performed in order to effectively accomplish the goals and objectives associated with success in that status. For instance, the way you behave when you are interacting with your parents is probably very different from the way that you behaved when you're interacting alone with your best friend, or when you're interacting with your professor, or when you're interacting with your coach, or when you're interacting with your intimate partner behind closed doors. In any one of those instances, the self that you present, the dramatic presentation of yourself, of the particular aspect of yourself that you're emphasizing, is going to be very, very different. This is dramaturgical analysis. Each one of us is an actor. Each one of us is engaged in a process by which we present ourselves to others. For the various different statuses that we occupy and roles that we play, we present ourselves in different costumes and in different ways, and it's actually possible to make two presentations at once. Take, for instance, the parent scolding a child. You've been doing this and you've been doing that, and this is going on and on, and suddenly the telephone rings and they stop and they say, "Oh, hello, how are you? Is everything okay?" It's like, where did that monster go? That was just, scolding the child a moment ago. Well, it's not that the monster went anywhere. It's that the dramatic presentation itself, associated with the various statuses that are occupied, is different. And it can be switched on or off depending upon which particular status the person is realizing themselves through. And that is determined by the social structure. Are you talking to a friend? Are you talking to your boss? Are you talking to your child? Those are the questions that, in this context, define the way that you make your dramatic presentation. Your status as a student calls for a number of different types of performance routines, roles. That is, for instance, one is attending class and paying attention, taking notes. Another is doing your studies independently at home. Another is doing research. Another is socializing with other students. All of these are various different performance routines that are associated with the single role that you're playing, that is the single part in the passion play that is life, called student, in other words. So the student is your role, and student is the main part. So statuses, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Your status student represents the part that you're playing. And that status has a number of different roles, and those are performance routines. You might say they are scripts associated with that part that you're playing. This is dramaturgical analysis. The other fundamentally important part of dramaturgical analysis is at any given time, according to Goffman, we have front stage and backstage regions in our lives. Front stage region is where we're making our performance for our primary intended audience. Backstage region is where we prepare our performance, where we put on our costumes, our makeup, where we critique our performances, and where we rehearse our performances. Backstage regions are where we talk to fellow actors when we're not in the view of our audience. We're open and much more candid with one another in backstage regions, while in front stage regions we tend to be formal and, once again, behave in a manner that is consistent with the presentation of self necessary to accomplish the specific objective. For example, in a restaurant, the backstage regions would be the restaurant's kitchen, where waiters and waitresses, cooks, chefs, busboys all interact with one another, and sometimes it's not a very pretty scene. The front stage region, however, is the dining area. There, everything is beautiful, everyone is friendly, everyone smiles, everything's clean and nice. Very, very different from what we see in the backstage region. Everyone cooperates in the front stage region. Only politeness abounds, whereas in backstage regions we know that's not necessarily the case. Since Goffman suggests that we're all dramatic performers in our day-to-day lives, some people take offense to this way of thinking. The common complaint or critique is, hold on just a second there, I'm me no matter where I go, no matter what I do. And this is not necessarily inconsistent with Goffman's dramaturgical theory. Essentially, Goffman argues that we can make two types of performances. One type is what we call a sincere performance, the type of performance that I'm making for you right now. I'm a sociology professor. I'm giving you this sociology lecture. This is what I do. It's real. But let's just say I weren't a sociology professor. Let's just say I were a fraud. Then, in fact, this would be an insincere performance, a performance that was meant to misinform you, whether the information was correct or not. If I were giving you information pertaining to me that were inaccurate, then that would be designed to misinform you. Insincere performances can run the range from white lies necessary for tactfulness and protecting the feelings of others, all the way to full-fledged con games where members of the audience, shills, assist in the performance, co-assist, you might say, the main actors, in using their cleverness to relieve you of money and or property. It's called running a con, and Goffman talks a lot about that in his book. I doubt we'll treat that on the examination, but I thought it might be interesting for you to realize that insincere performances describe lies of all sorts, whether they be simple lies that are harmless or complex sets of lies which are actually executed by people in concert with one another in order to accomplish specific nefarious objectives. So if we're all actors and we're all giving different performances, how can it be that these performances are sincere when they're so different for different audiences? Well, once again, as long as the actor believes in the persona he or she is presenting, and it is meant to express only information that is accurate, that is a sincere performance. Goffman simply suggests that in order to live in complex modern society, each and every individual must have a number of facets, faces, if you will, not necessarily fake or false, but definitely faces which are fashioned in a specific way to accomplish different objectives according to which particular status a person is actually realizing. Harold Garfinkel was an ethnomethodologist. In fact, he actually created the ethnomethodological research technique. In its earliest form, ethnomethodology was conducted by breaching experiments. A breaching experiment is an experiment in which the subject of the experiment is intentionally misinformed in some way in order to come to understand how their background expectations, their quote-unquote common sense, if you will, impacted the way that they interpreted the information which they received. In other words, how it impacted their assignment of meaning to the phenomena which they were experiencing. Garfinkel was important because he saw that while symbolic interactionists assume that meaning is assigned, no one had actually looked at the process whereby which it was assigned and what impacts that process. So his ethnomethodology was an experimental technique. Today it has progressed into something quite different, not important to us, but I would like to very briefly explain a couple of early ethnomethodological experiments to you. The first is an experiment which was conducted in elementary schools. A number of teachers were intentionally misinformed by the ethnomethodological researchers that their students, a small number among them, had tested at a gifted level. So the truth of the matter was all the students within the classes were, in fact, at the same level. None were gifted or special, and none were significant, academically speaking, in terms of their performance. But teachers, as I said, were misinformed by the researchers. 1 year later, tests showed that about just under 9 out of 10 of the students who had been misidentified as gifted were now scoring significantly higher on their achievement and performance test, 1 standard deviation above the norm, which is to say they were beginning to look very much like gifted children. The question you have to ask yourself is, how did this happen? Why did this happen? The teachers were very specifically instructed not to inform the children, not to inform their teachers, and their parents, and not to treat the children in any way differently from the others. What the research seems to suggest is that the teachers' interpretations of the children who had been identified as gifted was influenced by that false identification. Say, for instance, a child acts up in class, tells a joke. They're the class clown. They make everyone laugh. Normally, this would be seen as a disciplinary problem. However, since the teacher has been misinformed that the student is gifted, the teacher instead encourages the child to set apart from this particular part of the lesson, which is obviously boring them, to work on their comedy, and even gives them an opportunity to tell jokes for the class once a week, or perhaps once a day in the morning, something of that nature. In other words, the different response to exactly the same behavior, the interpretation of the behavior is different. In one instance, the normal instance, without any misidentification, therefore without any pre-held expectations associated in this particular manner, a child bursting out in class and telling a joke and making everyone laugh is seen as a disciplinary problem which should be punished. But when that child has been identified as gifted, suddenly the exact same behavior is interpreted as something that indicates talent, skill, potential to be cultivated. The fundamental difference in the interpretation has to do with the background expectancies, the background expectations that are held in the mind of the person who's interpreting the phenomena. Another experiment was conducted on college students. An ad was run in the college newspaper in the classified section, offering free academic and personal counseling for any students who would be willing to participate in social science research, either immediately or in the near future. Many students called the number, were informed that if they were willing to participate in social science research immediately or in the near future, that they could make arrangements to get an appointment to come on in. And so many did. When they arrived, they signed a release saying that they were willing to participate in research and so on, as previously stated. What they didn't realize, though, was that the research was beginning at that very moment. They had agreed to participate in this counseling program under the stipulations that they would not meet their counselors personally, but would be speaking to them through an intercom sitting on the table, like the one I'm leaning on here. And also that they would pose all of their questions to their counselors in a yes or no format. So if they asked a question to the counselor that wasn't in a yes or no format, the counselor would say to them, directly over the intercom, "I'm sorry, please, can you rephrase that question in a yes or no format?" So essentially, the students would talk about their problems. They were immediately, after coming and signing in, they were seated and then assigned to a small room where they were seated at a table alone, and then a counselor came on, and they began their conversation with the counselor. The student would tell about whatever the problems were in their life. For instance, their problems might have been wanting to change majors, or possibly wanting to drop out, or something that pertained to their personal relationships, breaking up, or possibly getting married or engaged, worried about being pregnant, worried about failing, disagreements with parents, all those sorts of things that college students experience as problems. And essentially they would speak with the counselor for extended periods of time. But before too long, in each and every interview, the responses that the counselors were giving to the students' questions were inconsistent, internally inconsistent, logically inconsistent, and in most instances, eventually, if not very quickly, downright contradictory. For instance, the counselor saying, yes, I think you should change your major. And then the student saying some more stuff about it. And then the student trying to get reaffirmation, yes, you think I should change my major. And then the counselor saying no. And then rather than the student wondering why there was a logical inconsistency between the two responses, that would have been crazy to think such a thing. They're talking to a counselor. It's with that background idea in their mind that they're talking to a counselor that no matter how nonsensical the answers were, they were able to twist around their own narrative in order to make those answers make sense. And what that means is that when we believe, you or I believe that we're getting information from a valid source, and that source gives us information on one day that's inconsistent with the information it gives us the next day, we assume that the information that was given to us the day before must have been incorrect. Or obviously we're getting the information from a valid source. If it changed from one day to the next, yesterday's information must have been false. But what Garfinkel's research showed was that this wasn't so at all, because in fact, there were no counselors. The people on the other end of the intercom from the students who were telling about all of their terrible personal problems, things that were wrecking their lives, potentially life-threatening, on the other end of the line were graduate students, and they were not even listening to the students' questions. They were only listening for when the students asked the questions, and then they were giving their answers from a random list of yeses and nos. And this is what ensured in each and every instance that the students would receive logically inconsistent and contradictory information. But once again, in every instance, rather than questioning the advice from the counselor, the students were always willing to reconsider and rewrite their own mental narrative in the context of the conversation with the counselor in order to make the nonsensical information make sense. So what Garfinkel shows is in the meaning assignment process, when we have false information, when we're operating from a false set of presuppositions, from a false set of expectancies, we can make sense out of nonsense. And by the way, that might be a big explanatory factor in American politics today. Until next time, I'm hoping that you're safe and you're well, and that you're well cared for.